What does it take to make workshops work? And how can we facilitate collaboration that sticks and leads to results? My name is Miriam Hartness, and with the Workshops Work podcast, I'm on the mission to find the magic ingredients that make workshops work. Today with me on the show is Jordan Bauer, and we speak about the future of facilitation, reinventing facilitation, facilitators as corporate therapists. Curious? Stay tuned. It's worth it. And by the way, if you don't have pen and paper at hand to take your own notes, scroll down to the show notes to download my free one-page summary. And now, enjoy. Hello, Jordan.
Hi, Miriam. So happy
Welcome
to be here
to the
today.
show. Yes, we already warmed up a little bit. So let me throw this question at you. When did you start calling yourself a facilitator?
Ooh, big question. And I definitely do. I mean, I'm a storyteller, so is it okay if I tell a bit of a story?
Please.
Yeah. So for me, the big story, like capital S story of my life happened about 10 or 11 years ago. I was living in Vancouver, which is where I live today, and I had a girlfriend, and she came up with this idea for us to spend 1,800 miles walking down the west coast of America. And this idea, if you can imagine, just kind of came out of the blue. And suddenly I found myself arguing over things like tents and sleeping bags and hiking boots and routes and all of these things with no real context to it. It would be as if, what are we having for dinner? Thai food. We're walking to Mexico, And I found myself in this really stunning kind of like planning for this strange thing that I kind of half wanted to do, but didn't really want to do. And as you might imagine, the relationship started to fall apart. And when she left, I panicked. And I like to say I'm a child of the 80s. So I was raised on romantic comedies. So, what do you do when your girlfriend leaves you? Yeah. What do you do when your girlfriend leaves you? Well, you do one huge romantic gesture to try to get her back. And, because the one piece of what I considered leverage at the time, I like to joke I was 29 going on 17. The piece of leverage I had was this idea to walk to Mexico. And so 2 weeks later, I put up a video on this brand new website at the time called Kickstarter. And I pitched this idea to make an art project, photography, travel, storytelling, walking to Mexico. It wasn't even half baked. It had barely been in the oven. And I put it up on the internet. And what I really wanted was for her to see it and for her to interpret that like this expression of love was this, it was speaking about the truth of our relationship. We were going to live happily ever after. But what actually happened is it became Kickstarter's project of the day. And so I was featured front and center on the Kickstarter website. And I had asked for $5,000 and suddenly money was just kind of rushing in. And next thing I knew, after I think 9 days, I had the $5,000, which meant I was now committed to, in the end, 138 people who gave me money to walk from Canada to Mexico. And so I remember on that day I got money. I went out for sushi in downtown Vancouver with my now ex-girlfriend. And I was pleading with her, like, I've got the money to do the thing that you've been talking about for this whole time. And what she literally said is, I'll think about it. And I spent the rest of the summer kind of hanging on this, like, is she going to do it? Was that just the kind of thing you just say to kind of brush somebody off? And long story short, on September 1st of 2010, I left Vancouver with a big backpack and a huge, heavy heart. And I spent the next 316 days walking down the west coast of America by myself.
Wow.
Right. And what I think is interesting about my trip is that, there's a very famous hiking trail through the US that's called the Pacific Crest Trail. And that goes through forests and mountains. It was, if you know that book, Wild by Cheryl Strayed, she walked that. And that's a trip where you're like out in the wilderness, face to face with bears, and who else can imagine what else is out there. But for me, I decided to walk the coastline, which meant I was walking down beaches and trails and through forests, but I was literally going through towns and cities. So over the Golden Gate Bridge into San Francisco, I walked through LA I was in all these smaller towns along the coast of Oregon and Northern California. And that meant that I was having these interactions with just normal people. So I would be in a cafe and, I had my big beard and my big backpack with all my camping gear, and friendly people would kind of make conversation as I'm drinking my coffee and say like, where are you going? And I'd be like, I'm walking to Mexico. And people would then ask the follow-up question, which of course was, why? And I would be like, my girlfriend left me, blah, 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 blah. And like the whole soul and heart of my story would come pouring out. And slowly I started to realize that my story had gravity to it. And what gradually started to happen is as I got sick of hearing myself complain, I started to ask other people, have you ever been through something like this? Mm. What's your love story? And I would spend hours with strangers in all these different circumstances, like recording people's stories and like dredging out this deep emotional stuff inside of them. We'd have this moment. I would cry, you would cry, we'd hug. I'll never forget you again. And then I'd leave the cafe and I'd walk 100 yards. And then there was somebody working in their garden and they'd be like, hey, where are you going? And I'd be like, I'm walking to Mexico. And so in the end, I probably did this with about maybe 5,000 different people. And so gradually I started to think of myself as like a facilitator of experiences, because I would show up with these people and I would bring my literal and figurative baggage. And as I kind of unpacked it, we would kind of look at it together and we'd figure out, okay, well, what do we have in common? What's your baggage that you want to lay out in front of us too? And at the end of my little show, I would pack up my baggage and continue on. But that was when I first started saying, okay, there's something here. There's a skill. I didn't know what it meant professionally yet, but I started to feel almost as if this facilitation was my calling. And, now fast forward over the last 10 years, I've been able to start to put it into a variety of different forms. But for me, facilitation is the doing, not just the job title, if that makes sense.
Beautiful. Thank you for sharing this story.
Yeah, you're welcome. And
it's impressive how it unfolds on so many different levels. Also, starting from the relationship issues, first, yes-anding. Yes, let's do that, without actually knowing what you're buying yourself into. And then the storming phase that the relationship didn't survive. And then saying yes again, trying to make it happen, and then having to do it by yourself. What became possible for you from a mindset and skill set through this challenge?
I think from a skill set perspective, the ability to listen and to sit with people, and specifically to help take people to depth. I think when I was younger and more naively, I thought people were what I'll just call their artifice. People are as they appear. You have to take what people say at face value because they said it. In a couple, I said, I'm sorry, And then slowly it was like, oh, there's actually layers of meaning beneath these words and these ideas and the way that we show up. And as I peeled back the layers in myself, I started asking myself this succession of very therapeutic questions, starting first with like, why did she leave me? And then it's like, why do I always date girls like this? And then it's like, well, what role do my parents' divorce have in, what's my trauma? And then eventually, like, what do I do about my trauma? And how do I come back together in a different form so that it can be healed in some way? As I was doing these things, like I joked at the beginning, I'm 29 going on 17 and I have to get her back and Kickstarter and all this. Like here I have the stereo over my head, like John Cusack and Say Anything. I'm imagining myself in this very heroic way, but like, where did that identity even come from? Who told me that was the right way to do things?
Yeah.
So, I'm a systems thinker and I never really stopped and took the microscope of systems thinking and put it back on myself. And by doing that, I think that started to build a mindset that now makes it possible professionally. I try to bring the same, or I do bring the same thing to client engagements. What's really going on here? Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
And this actually circles nicely into the question that came up for me is the role of storytelling. You mentioned that at one point you felt the gravity of your story and like, okay, I cannot drag the story with me. I have to reinvent the story, and I have to almost as if you can reinvent yourself by the story you're telling of yourself. So what did you learn about storytelling in this journey? And what do you think that most people still get wrong about storytelling?
I think most people think that story is history. So, there's multiple layers there. One is like If you ask people, Miriam, how did you become who you are today? Most people will default to what you can think of as like a chronology.
CV.
But when I was 22, I graduated from this university, and then I had this job, and then this happened, and then that happened. And, fact. And then here I am today. So that's all true. It's not that you're lying. It's just that there's I want to say almost a shallowness to that. It's like you're never actually, what did you say?
Nobody cares.
Nobody cares. And you're never taking me into the depth. And what actually is interesting about story is its three-dimensionality. It's like, how did your world operate back then? And how did the transformation enact some kind of transformation in the way your world functioned? For me in my story, like so much of my story is about reinventing relationship, relationship to my ex, relationship to my future wife, relationship to my parents. I didn't yet understand that all of those things were in dynamic opposition to each other, kind of like a molecular structure. And the thing is that as you start to pull one of those molecules, the whole structure starts to shift. And so when storytelling is the same thing, like at the beginning of a great Netflix show or a movie, we meet a character, but what we're really meeting is the structure of their world. This is their partner. This is their estranged parent. This is their bad job that they don't love anymore. And then over the course of the movie or the show, we watch them move through this transformation that shifts the molecules as well. And I think as storytellers, it's like what we're looking for is not the history of what happened, but like what's actually happening in the molecular structure, because that's where the real story is. So on this trip, I would listen to people, and I would listen not just for like, what's the surface story, but like, what's the story you're really telling? And what does that reveal about what you believe about the world and how you came to that place? Storytelling at depth.
Yeah. It reminds me of a book that I recently read. It's called You're Not Listening and Why It Matters. And there the author, I don't remember her name, mentioned that what we often forget to ask is, why is this person telling me this piece of information right now? And just this extra level of curiosity that would then replace the judgment of, oh, why are you telling me that? Already know that? Do you want to teach me? It's kind of, oh. And then why is this person telling this story in this way?
Yeah, story theory is that every character has wants and needs. There's a tension between what I want and what I need. And often what I want, what I think I want at a conscious level, is in opposition to what I need. I need my girlfriend back. It's like, well, no, what I really needed was growth and perspective and wisdom. And to see that, the relationship wasn't really working in the first place,
And maybe self-love.
And self-love. And, we can go down that rabbit hole, right? But in organizations, it's the same thing. It's like, I want to hit this goal. And it's like, okay, cool. What do you need here? What do you mean I need to hit this goal? It's like the conversation becomes really circular because it's too shallow.
So how do you help them to break out from this vicious circle?
I mean, that's a really deep question, for 5 minutes or 10 minutes into the conversation. Sometimes I wish I had a magic wand where I could just, wave stuff over somebody. Yeah, done. Transformation, that's going to be $50. See you later, I think for me, it's like understanding the structure of psychology and belief inside of myself then helps me kind of tease out where it's hollow in somebody else. I love Esther Perel. You must know Esther Perel, of course.
Yes.
And I remember listening to one of her podcasts, Where Should We Begin, where she does the thing with the couple. And she uses really lovely metaphor of knocking on the wall of a relationship to listen for where it's hollow. And, you hit the right note somewhere and you're like, oh, there's a stud. There's a stud. There's a stud. Oh, this is a space where there's not much weight to what the person is saying. And so for me, it's like a felt experience where I listen and someone says something and I'm like, that doesn't just click right in me. It's not landing. So that's where I start to scratch the surface. And then, the different style or the limiting beliefs start to come out. I feel my way in, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And for me, this sounds, and maybe I'm ignorant, surely I'm naive. This sounds like a coaching practice. So I can perfectly imagine you doing this on a one-on-one context and to help individuals, leaders to differentiate between their needs, their wants, recraft maybe their story. If I'm not mistaken, you're doing this for organizations. So how can I imagine that? Because there's a big level of abstraction there.
Well, certainly, and a very specific level of practicality. Imagine you can do coaching one-on-one with someone in the same way you can do therapy one-on-one with somebody. But then you bring your partner into the room and now you're doing therapy on the relationship. The relationship is a different entity than the two people involved. There's the two people, and then there's the construct of what we've created together. And I think that's very digestible in a marriage, of course, or, in a relationship, but it's the same thing in a group or team environment. It's like we are all a group of individuals, whether we're two or whether we're 200,000, and we're subscribing to something that has a life and a narrative of its own. And, when you start to dig into these narratives, whether they're my own story or the story of my company, they're mythic in that they have these structural ideas about what does it mean to be in a company? What does it mean to have a boss? What does it mean to work? What does it mean to perform? Those are the stories that we take for granted often when, I just need a job. So you've got a job, so I'm going to get hired by you. It's like, when you look back on that, you start to realize, I was connected to something in this boss that didn't appeal to me in that boss. So just to say that there's this complexity of narrative. And in the same way that Esther Perel knocks on the wall and finds something that's hollow in an individual or in a couple, when you knock on the wall, you can find things that are hollow in the organization. As an example, some of the stories are, this will never work. We've already tried that. That's not the way you're supposed to do it. Those are mythic, defined stories that exist in people's day-to-day that sometimes are incorrect or out of touch. Yeah, go for
it. Yes. I totally get that. And I believe that individuals are very talented in crafting a clear story to make this belief valid and to validate it wherever they can and to defend it against the beautiful word you used in our exploration call was corporate therapist.
Yeah.
Or facilitator. So what is your strategy to get your finger in this story to make them realize that it's maybe not valid and still not to be thrown out the door after the first why question or that?
Well, the strategy is be honest and be real with people. So, when those mistaken or limiting beliefs start to come up, then it's slow them down and help them unpack it. When I grew up as a consultant, I'm a consultant now, but I'm in my young 40s. When I grew up, to be a consultant was to provide the solution. So I felt a lot of pressure to kind of come in and solve people's problems for them, right? And over the last couple of years, it's been a reinventing of what it means to be a consultant. Now what I bring is space and process.
Facilitation.
Which means, right? Would you say?
Facilitation.
Yeah, I bring facilitation, where the success of the engagement doesn't hang on me coming up with some sort of solution to your problem. You would never go to a therapist for your relationship and ask for a diagnosis and, what are the 3 pills I should take and call me in the morning. You go, you go because you want to engage in some sort of a process. And so similarly, what I'm really good at is revealing what is happening beneath the surface here that's interfering. And I think, in general, business has been really myopic in the sense that everything is about goals. Everything is about a straightforward way to get there. And if you don't have the right tool, you go out and you buy or you implement the tool. And so everything becomes layer upon layer upon layer of system. And, there was a certain validity, and that works in some contexts for some time. But part of what's happening right now in the world is there's an underlying transformation about what business is and what role organizations should fill. I was in the car the other day listening to a radio story about Burger King. They posted something on Twitter about more women should be in the kitchen. And it was got everybody all riled up. And it was like, no, more women should be chefs. Something like 29% of chefs are women and there should be more women. So it's like, great argument, but it's Burger King. Like 5 years ago, to think that Burger King would be wading into feminist issues would be totally unthinkable. And now it's, as they say, it's table stakes. And so suddenly the function of an organization in the world and in the lives of employees has shifted literally overnight. And so often the limiting belief is like, oh no, we're still doing business in the way we were doing it in the 2010s. And it's like, it's not like that anymore. So like my process is at some level helping people realize that, but helping them come to that realization in their own way.
A simple deck of cards can be a brilliant way to engage a group. You can use them to stimulate thought, inject energy, or spark lively conversations. But how can you use cards when you're facilitating virtually? Deckhive.com is a brand new platform that enables you to use cards on screen just as you would face-to-face. Invite people to a shared real-time session and then let them select, move and flip cards over. Our growing library includes many popular card decks, including picture cards, strengths cards, emotion cards and more. But if we don't have what you need, you can even create your own deck really easily. Use the code WORKSHOPSWORK when you subscribe to a paid monthly plan and you'll get the first month completely free. Go to deckhive.com and give it a try.
And just a quick sidetrack before coming back to the facilitation bit. Do you think that this change is due to the pandemic, to the last week's podcast guest called it the great pause that we collectively went in? Or is it due to working from home? Or what is it that made this shift happen?
I would say D, all of the above. It's like, it's a little bit of everything. And it's also the things that we don't quite understand yet. It's like, it's not, and by that I mean, some of the reason for the change isn't immediately apparent. It's not necessarily causal. I think some of the things that are at play here is the pandemic, climate change, new technologies, like suddenly we can interact with each other and therefore search for work, engage with companies, buy different products in ways that were unthinkable even a couple of years ago. Then there's like the overarching political and social narratives, George Floyd, Me Too, like what it means to live in society is shifting so monumentally. And all of that stuff is happening in tandem with each other.
And I wonder whether the fact of not going to the office on a daily basis
Totally
put us away from one echo chamber, maybe into a different echo chamber, because I don't believe that we got rid of the echo chamber, that we haven't lived in one before the pandemic. But maybe before just being in this office routine, where we were exposed to the same narrative, the same story on a daily basis that we didn't take time to question. Suddenly we are now in a different context. We have access to different information, and maybe we have more distance to what it means to be at work. Actually.
Yeah, I entirely agree. And, when I was younger, before I did this big walking trip, I loved to backpack. So I backpacked in India and Southeast Asia and South America, like all these different places. And, the great privilege of backpacking style travel is the collision with other culture. Where, there I am on this pack train in India where like people are around me everywhere. And I'm like living and breathing this experience temporarily in a certain way through a certain identity and body and so on. But I'm also really forced to confront the collision of culture between what I thought was normal before and what is normal now. And I think you're making a great point. It's like what I thought was normal in the office is like, oh yeah, I can bring my kid to work, but one day a year. Where I show the kid, like, this is how work works, and this is my office, and these are my colleagues, and now back to school with you. And suddenly it's like, no, my kid is running in the middle of my meeting, and you're going to have to accept it. And maybe even they're part of it in some way. Mm. And that's just one example of many, many of the way we're shifting what it means to go to work. And I think that is one of the elements that's playing a massive role here. And I think it's just one step more. It's like all of those things are true. It is all of those things, but it's also something a little bit beyond where like we're questioning some of the core ideas about what it means to be human, what it means to be in community, in relationship, a citizen of the planet, and so on. And I think we don't have the answers yet. And by that, I mean, I think there's a new answer coming that hasn't arrived yet. And I think that's also a driver for this change.
Which makes me wonder and come back to something you said earlier about the role of the advisor or consultant, that before the consultant came in, let me tell you what you do. I have it. I have my spreadsheets and I have my PowerPoint presentations and let's get to work. And this has changed to coming in and rather facilitating a conversation exploration where the organization finds out themselves. And I wonder whether the 2020, this great pause, also the great we don't know, where collectively for the first time, maybe in history, we collectively had permission to say, we don't know. Maybe this has accelerated the shift from calling consultants and expecting consultants to know, to calling facilitators and being open to find out. Or am I maybe too optimistic?
No, I think you're right. I mean, I think it's the rise of process over outcome. Like once upon a time, to be in work was to be outcome focused. And to be a facilitator, I was thinking about this in preparation for this call, like the etymology of facilitator is like to be an easy maker. We're professional easy makers. And the wonderful thing about being an easy maker is it's massively interchangeable. Like the traffic police officer who's directing traffic at an intersection is a facilitator. They're an easy maker in the same way that we're a facilitator when we're in a group conversation. And I think one of the things that's happening for us in our job function is like to be a facilitator used to be helping people have a conversation or lead a workshop. But now it's like in any context, how do you easy make change? How do you easy make transformation? How do you easy make visioning? This isn't just about like showing people the steps, but it's in some way participating in the creative journey with people. Like one more thing, I try to easy make vision and empathy. So like how I do it, whether that's in workshops or conversations or consulting or whatever, is separate from what it is I'm trying to do. I'm trying to help people see in a new way. And when you can see in a new way, you can solve in a new way, but you can't solve in a new way until you see in a new way. You have to see and comes first.
You need to be able to at least imagine a better future.
Totally.
Thinking back of the corporate therapist.
Totally.
I'm kind of fascinated by the idea of the similarity or the perception of a facilitator like a therapist, where I'm also thinking of a book that I recently finished where the author referred to a relationship where everyone brings in 100% of responsibility. It's not shared responsibility. No, everyone has the full 100% in order to make it work. And in an organization, it's the same. And you don't book one therapy session. It's just, if you sign up, you know that it's a process, it's a long-term thing that requires sweat and tears, hard work, and collaboration. Do you think then that the times of a one-off workshop facilitation are somehow over? Because we have to recognize that we cannot do any work in a one-off session.
I think so, but I don't think they'll disappear overnight, because there's a lot of people who don't work at this level. And frankly, there's a lot of buyers who want to buy something that's like a one-off solution. I mean, I have this pressure in my business all the time where people are like, yeah, but can you just do it in 4 hours? And can it happen next week, And it's like, well, it depends what you want to happen. And for some people, that question in itself is too intense because it means breaking down the whole corporate structure. Like, what do you mean? I have my budget. I have my deliverables. I already know how this is going to work. Do you fit into this? And my role is to subvert the whole way of thinking and to be like, no. What do you want to have happen? What's the vision here? And that's really off-putting or disconcerting for people because it's confusing. And I would say too, like in corporations to this day, the paradigm that people use to talk about change is called change management. You must have heard this term before. And what change management means is we're in state A, we're trying to get to state B, And here are the series of steps and communication plans and workshops that we're going to use to manage somebody's change from A to B. And I think the paradigm is shifting into something that's much more about A to infinity, where it's like, how do I go to a place I've never experienced before? How do I go to a level of creativity, a level of 100% responsibility, a new working dynamic that I've never physically had an experience of before? You can't just tell me about what that is. You got to actually take me there emotionally into that and let me try it out and let me panic and let me go through the chaos that's going to ensue. I can't come in and say, well, it's going to start with this, and in 3 months, this is going to happen. In 6 months, this is going to happen, because it's too mysterious and dynamic and alive. And I think it's scary for corporations because of that, because it's uncontrollable, but it can be influenced and it can be done well, even though it doesn't have that same level of control, if that makes sense.
Yes, it makes a lot of sense. And it indeed sounds scary, because it sounds like something that doesn't have an end, as you said. So it's an ongoing process and project in a world that needs budgets and timelines. It's a very scary thought. And I think it can equally be scary for the therapist, I'm saying, the facilitator. See, the facilitator coming in, not knowing what they can actually promise, which we never can, because it depends on the group. And still to engage then in, it's almost like a task for a wizard. Embarking on a journey where we don't know the end, where we shoot for the moon. So what's the inner game that this future role of facilitators?
Yeah, well, I would say that it starts with the magical word discovery, where, you come in and I have the humility sometimes, not always, right? To be like, I actually don't know what's best here. And no matter how much time I spent planning and thinking about what I thought this was going to be, do I have the ability to think on my feet and see what's actually happening in real time? And so I have to make sure that my clients don't feel like, oh, this is just going to be this open-ended thing we're going to be throwing money at for the next 10 years. It's got to have some discrete deliverable. It's got to have some direction and outcome. And what a good discovery does is it allows for the outcome to emerge. There's this moment of like, oh, I see what's going on here. Like, this is the diagnosis. And now here are the steps that we can take to interrupt old patterns, experiment with doing it in a different way, engage people in the process of transformation, but also keep the corporate goals in mind. So find a way to balance those two things. So it's not like the kind of parody of therapy is like, It's like, no, it has to be more precise and it has to be impactful, but it needs to start with some discovery of what that even means.
And what it means for those who are engaged, right? Because again, if I think of the opposition of the consultant who comes in, okay, that's our plan for the change management. These are our milestones. These are the deliverables. And then suddenly it becomes a management process in the way that, okay, I tell you what you do, and then you do it, and then you change, and then we check the boxes. Where now what I'm hearing from what you say is more about, okay, let's identify what the real issue is and then define the milestones together that we want to reach in our collaborative work.
And I mean, to your earlier question, like part of the inner game is a redefinition of what power means. Like once upon a time, to be powerful was to be in a position that brought all the, the trappings of power. I remember in the spring, I saw an article in the newspaper. There was a photograph of the G7 finance ministers. So, the most powerful countries in the world, the finance ministers, and they were all posing for a group shot, Russia and, Canada, US, all these, Britain, France, and they're all dressed in matching dark suits, matching understated corporate ties, and matching black face masks, because it's the pandemic, with their little country flag in the middle. And I'm looking at these people and I'm going like, these are the most powerful people in the world. They don't even get to decide what they wear in the morning, And I think part of what's shifting in the world is a definition of what power is and how power works. Like in the old organizational structure, to be powerful was to tell people what to do. And, oh, we can't tell our employees the truth because then they're going to all leave. Well, guess what? They're already leaving. So what we have to figure out is, how do we share power in some way where, like, we are taking, to use your lovely word, 100% responsibility. I'm responsible for a certain level of management and direction and vision, but that doesn't make me better than you. It just means I manage a different portfolio of what power means. And when we start to see that, we can start to subvert the idea that, like, I need to be in charge of this every step of the way. So often that's where the therapy happens. It's like for the person running the whole project. Are you trying to maintain your own power here? And are you willing to shift something about the way you think about management? Because if you do, you can make possible something that wasn't possible before when you were the one who had to be in charge. Does that make sense?
Yes. And I wonder, the association that I have is that the way you describe power, or new definition of power, is almost like what happens with love. If you keep love to yourself, it dies. But if you share love, it increases, right? The more you share it, the more there is. And from what I hear you saying is, with power, it might be similar, which is counterintuitive, especially in the old world, if we may already call it like this.
Yeah, I agree. It's like, do I feel my power inside of myself? Do I see, like, not just my structural power and my privilege? Like, that stuff is so important for me to see. But power is also my ability to, like, face an important challenge in my life and be honest and vulnerable with myself and others. And when I start to see that my power is, like, infinite in an inner sense, then it's way easier for me to give it away. You know, like, I don't need to be the one who's speaking over you to tell you all the things I think. I think a lot of things, but in this context, in this conversation, like, it's not appropriate for me to be the one who occupies all of the space, you know?
Thank you for pointing this out, because it's giving away power, or sharing power does not mean giving away even 1% of this 100% of responsibility, right? It's carrying the baggage and still sharing.
Totally. And then I can be both. Like, sometimes I need to be authoritative, you know, and sometimes I can be more giving or forgiving or space making. Like, as a facilitator, I'm always trying to figure out, what does the moment call for? And do I need to interrupt this blowhard who's just talking and talking and won't stop? It's like, sometimes it's like, hey, we heard enough from you. Now we're going to hear this person. There's my, like, authoritative. And then other times it's like, oh, let me relax and let me be in this kind of weird, mysterious uncertainty and just kind of allow things to happen for a little while, because it feels like it's going somewhere.
And what makes the difference?
In terms of the approach, or?
Yes. So what is a moment where you let it happen, and what is the moment you interrupt? And is it, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's so nuanced. I would say at the simplest level, it's like intuition and empathy. Maybe one step more is like reading the room and feeling the room. You know, I said earlier that, like, part of what I see in my work is I'm a facilitator of vision and a facilitator of empathy. My experience of those things is not just conceptual, but they're like music notes. You know, it's like when you go to a good party and you walk into the room and you just kind of feel like everyone's having a really good time. You could diagnose the qualities in the bullet points, like, you know, good food and space and great people, but that's not the feeling that the room creates. So, you know, sometimes there's like there's a note or a chord that gets struck, and I can viscerally feel it in my body as if something is singing out, and I'm trying to respond to that. Mm-hmm. I know that's really abstract, but I'm trying to keep it there. Like, one of my favorite passions on the side is I just got into, the past couple of months, ecstatic dancing, you know, which is, yeah, you're into it too. It's like, I never would have thought to be into something like this. And I grew up as like a straight guy in the world. You know, my dancing moves were like, boom, 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 boom. Everything's like low and don't look at me. And then to be in this ecstatic dancing environment is not only to just express myself in a way I want, but to feel how the dynamics in the room are shifting in real time, and to be able to read what's happening with one person or the whole room at once.
Yes. Yes. And what I found fascinating is that these ecstatic dance parties, I don't know how it is in Canada, in the Netherlands, they are facilitated.
Yes.
So for those in the audience who don't know ecstatic dancing, there are 3 rules. Number 1 is there are no shoes. Number 2, there's no alcohol or drugs. And number 3 is there's no speaking. So basically everyone arrives and then there's a sort of kind of meditation or a big circle and guidelines on how to behave. And then people just dance, but it's facilitated, especially the start. So you create this safety, this environment where it's okay to be just you and dance without rules.
Yeah. And, it's like DJ as facilitator. Like you never think about it in that, or maybe you don't often think about a facilitator in that way, but like a DJ at a club, let alone at an ecstatic dance setting, is reading the room and figuring like, where is the energy? Is it peaking too much? Is it too low? How do I shift what's happening here? And you're doing it in this nonverbal way.
Believe it or not, but I recorded an entire podcast conversation about the similarity between a DJ and a facilitator.
I love it.
Yeah, with Howard Gray.
And, but in the corporate environment, like those of us who've come to facilitation through corporate because they told us to do it, it's really easy to approach facilitation in this very corporate way, which means like read all the books and create all the frameworks and design process and design thinking, like all of that stuff is great, but it's always only half of the story. The other half of the story is abstract and nonlinear and non-conceptual and embodied. And I think to be a good facilitator, you need to be able to move through both worlds, which is like, what do I think this moment needs? And then what do I feel this moment needs? And will I allow myself to move from one to the other?
Thank you for staying tuned and listening to the show. I appreciate your attention as I know how busy you are. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe and engage by sharing your comments and thoughts, and visit workshops.work to download the one-page summary. I'm looking forward to seeing you back at the next episode, and I wish you a fruitful day.